Date, August 14, 2008. Location, Willow Creek, Maine. The clock struck midnight, but the little town of Willow Creek remained shrouded in an eerie silence. The air was cool and still, the faint chirp of crickets the only sound breaking the oppressive calm. At the end of a quiet cul-de-sac stood a weathered house, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with grime. This was Margaret Lowell's home, a fragile monument to time's relentless march. Inside, Margaret Lowell, a 98-year-old widow, sat in her rocking chair. Her thin frame was dwarfed by the oversized seat, her silvery hair coiled neatly into a bun. She wore a faded floral dress, one she'd kept for decades, as if preserving a piece of her younger days. The chair creaked softly as she dozed. The open photo album on her lap, a snapshot of a bygone era. But outside, the stillness was broken. Carter Hayes crouched beneath a window, his heart pounding in his chest. He gripped his camcorder tightly, its lens gleaming faintly in the moonlight. At just 16, Carter already carried the darkness of someone far older, the kind born from a life of neglect, isolation, and a growing fascination with the macabre. Carter had been watching Margaret for weeks, studying her habits with obsessive precision. Tonight, his curiosity had turned to a sinister purpose. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted knife. The blade glinted briefly as he tested its edge against his thumb, a flicker of excitement crossing his face. The old wooden door creaked as Carter pushed it open, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, the musty scent of mothballs and dust hanging heavy in the air. The ticking of an old grandfather clock echoed ominously, each second amplifying the tension in his mind. Margaret stirred in her chair, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, confused by the sudden presence in her home. "Who?" she began, her voice weak and frail. But Carter was already moving. With a sudden, calculated motion, he drove the knife into her chest. A sharp gasp escaped her lips before she fell silent, her head slumping forward. The photo album slid from her lap, its pages scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. Carter stood over her body, panting slightly, the weight of the act both thrilling and suffocating. He raised his camcorder, its red recording light blinking steadily. "This is it," he muttered, his voice trembling with exhilaration. "This is the story." For the next 2 hours, Carter meticulously filmed Margaret's lifeless body. He posed her hands, brushed back her hair, and even adjusted the angle of the dim lamp to cast the right shadows. He spoke softly, narrating his actions as if creating a twisted documentary. "Here," he whispered, zooming in on her frail hands. "The texture, the lines, they tell a story of time, of decay." But as the minutes passed, the thrill began to wane, replaced by a gnawing unease. The house seemed alive now, creaks in the floorboards, the groan of the wind pressing against the windows. Carter's confidence faltered, and his hands began to shake. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. "Mrs. Lowell," a man's voice called. "It's Harold from next door. Are you all right? I thought I heard something." Panic surged through Carter. He grabbed his camcorder and scrambled for the back door, leaving the knife on the floor next to Margaret's chair. As he slipped out into the night, the neighbor peered through the window. His face twisted in horror at the sight of Margaret's lifeless body, her floral dress soaked in blood. By the time the police arrived, Carter was long gone, vanishing into the dense woods at the edge of the neighborhood. But he hadn't left empty-handed. The camcorder, clutched tightly in his grasp, held every gruesome detail of that night, a testament to his twisted mind. As sirens wailed in the distance, Carter crouched under a canopy of trees, rewinding the tape and watching the footage with an almost childlike fascination. He smiled to himself, the weight of his actions not yet fully sinking in. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. The sun rose reluctantly over Willow Creek the next morning, its golden rays doing little to warm the chill left in the hearts of its residents. Margaret Lowell's murder was the kind of horror that didn't belong in a small, quiet town like this. Police cars and yellow tape now surrounded the old house on Maple Lane, their stark presence a cruel intrusion into the sleepy neighborhood. Inside the house, the scene was frozen in time, every gruesome detail carefully preserved by the first responders. Margaret's lifeless body still sat in the rocking chair, her head slumped forward, a blood-soaked knife lying inches from her frail hand. Detective Angela Reed arrived on the scene, her no-nonsense demeanor cutting through the quiet chatter of the officers. She had seen her share of gruesome murders, but this one had a haunting quality to it, a certain intimacy in the violence. Angela walked carefully into the room, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. "What do we have?" she asked Officer Carter, the young patrolman who had been first on the scene. "Neighbor found her?" Carter replied, his voice tinged with unease. "Said he knocked when he heard noises last night. When she didn't answer, he looked through the window and saw this." Angela's gaze settled on Margaret's face, her features frozen in a final expression of pain. "Whoever did this wasn't in a hurry," Angela said, noting the meticulous arrangement of the scene. "This wasn't random." Her eyes fell on the camcorder lying on the floor, its lens cracked from being dropped. She picked it up carefully, examining it. "Get this to forensics," she instructed. "I want every second of footage off this thing." Meanwhile, Carter Hayes was holed up in an abandoned shack deep in the woods. The adrenaline of the previous night had worn off, leaving him jittery and paranoid. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his camcorder clutched in his hands. The tape inside wasn't perfect, he had dropped it in his panic, but it still captured enough to send a chill down his spine. He pressed play, watching Margaret's lifeless eyes stare back at him through the flickering lens. "Whitter," Carter whispered, pausing on a close-up of her hands. The wrinkles and veins fascinated him, as though they told a story only he could understand. But then he heard it, the distant sound of a police siren. Carter's breath caught in his throat, and he scrambled to his feet, clutching the camcorder to his chest. He peeked through the boarded-up window, scanning the woods for movement. Back at the Lowell residence, forensics had finished analyzing the scene. Angela sat in her car, reviewing the footage extracted from the camcorder. Her brow furrowed as she watched the distorted video, Carter's eerie narration chilling her to the core. "This is where it ends," Carter's voice said from the tape, his tone disturbingly calm. "This is where everything stops. Time, life, meaning. It's all captured here." Angela paused the video, her stomach twisting. "Who the hell are you?" she muttered, her eyes narrowing. The clues were sparse, but one thing was clear. Carter hadn't planned to stop. That night, the town buzzed with fear. News of Margaret's murder spread quickly, parents locking their doors and keeping their children close. Local reporters descended on the scene, their cameras capturing every angle of the house. In the woods, Carter watched the live broadcast from a small TV in his hideout, his lips curling into a smile. They didn't know who he was yet, but he knew they would soon. "This is just the beginning," he whispered to himself, pressing record on the camcorder once more. The Lowell residence had transformed into a makeshift command center, with officers, detectives, and forensic teams combing through every inch of the property. The small living room, once a space of quiet solitude for Margaret, now bustled with quiet urgency. Detective Angela Reed stood at the center of it all, piecing together the fragments of a chilling story. Angela leaned against the counter in the small kitchen, reviewing the evidence logs. The most damning item was the camcorder, which contained a bizarre, almost ritualistic recording of Margaret's final moments. Angela hadn't been able to watch it all in one sitting. The footage was too grotesque. "Detective!" a voice called. It was Officer Carter, his young face pale. He held a thin stack of documents. "What is it?" she asked, taking the papers. "We pulled some prints from the camcorder," he said. "They don't match anyone in the system, but we did find one thing, an old police report filed years ago." Angela scanned the file. It detailed a complaint about a teenage boy, Carter Hayes, who had been caught trespassing in another elderly resident's backyard, recording video footage. The boy had been let off with a warning. Carter Hayes," Angela said aloud, her mind racing. Where is he now? Carter was closer than anyone realized. Deep in the woods, he sat in his hideout, surrounded by notebooks filled with sketches and scribbled ramblings. His camcorder sat on a rickety table, recording him as he spoke directly to the lens. "They're looking for me," he said, his voice calm but tinged with excitement. "But they don't understand. This isn't even about them. This isn't even about her. It's about the story." His hand shook slightly as he opened one of his notebooks, revealing a crude drawing of Margaret Lowell in her rocking chair, surrounded by blood. Next to it was a list of potential future targets. "Every piece has its place," he continued, flipping the pages. "And every story needs an ending." Back at the precinct, Angela gathered her team for a briefing. They had tracked Carter's last known address to a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. His parents, long estranged, had abandoned the property years ago, leaving Carter to fend for himself. Angela stood in front of the precinct's whiteboard, pointing to a grainy photograph of Carter. "This kid isn't just disturbed, he's meticulous," she said, her voice steady. "He planned this, and if we don't stop him, he'll do it again." As the search expanded, Carter's paranoia grew. He began to hear phantom voices in the woods, footsteps in the dead of night. He recorded everything obsessively, speaking into the camera like a man confessing to a trusted confidant. "This isn't panic," he whispered, staring into the lens. "This is clarity. They think they can stop the story, but they can't. I'm just the messenger." Carter knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. But that was part of the plan. Detective Angela Reed stood in the woods, her flashlight cutting through the dense trees. The search party moved in coordinated silence, their radios crackling softly. "Spread out," she ordered, her voice firm but quiet. "He's here somewhere." As Angela pushed deeper into the woods, she came across the shack. Its broken roof and rotting wood gave it the appearance of a forgotten relic. She signaled for the others to stay back and approached the door slowly. Inside, Carter watched her through a crack in the wall. He smiled, clutching his camcorder tightly. "This is it," he whispered, his heart pounding. "The final chapter." The night air was thick with tension as Detective Angela Reed stood outside the dilapidated shack. Her flashlight cast long shadows against the warped wooden walls, its beam illuminating every crack and crevice. The rest of her team waited a safe distance away, their radios quiet but ready for action. Angela motioned for them to stay back. She needed to assess the situation before risking confrontation. Inside the shack, Carter Hayes was crouched behind the table, clutching his camcorder like a lifeline. The blinking red light of the device reflected off his pale face, his unkempt hair falling into his eyes. He peeked through a crack in the wood, watching Angela's steady approach. She looked composed, but Carter could see the tension in her movements. "They've come for me," he muttered, setting the camcorder down to adjust its angle. He wanted this moment captured perfectly. Every story needs a climax. Angela reached the door, her hand hovering over her gun holster. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the silence around her almost deafening. She turned her flashlight to the door, revealing a crude drawing scratched into the wood. A stick figure in a rocking chair, surrounded by jagged lines of red ink. "Carter Hayes!" Angela called, her voice steady. "We know you're in there. Step out with your hands up." "No one has to get hurt." Inside, Carter's lips curled into a smile. He pressed the record button on the camcorder and stood slowly, the knife he had used on Margaret Lowell gripped tightly in his other hand. "You'll write about this," he whispered to himself. "They'll remember." Angela heard movement inside and tensed. She motioned for the backup team to move in closer, but not to engage unless necessary. Suddenly, the door creaked open slightly, and Angela caught a glimpse of Carter's shadow moving within the shack. "Carter, this is your last chance," she said, her voice firm. "Put the weapon down, and we'll talk." Carter stepped into the doorway, his lanky frame silhouetted against the dim light of the camcorder behind him. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Angela's, a mix of defiance and exhilaration in his gaze. "You don't understand," Carter said, his voice calm but unsettling. "This isn't about you or me. It's about the story." Angela's instincts kicked in. She drew her gun but kept it aimed low. "Put the knife down, Carter. It's over." "No," Carter replied, his voice rising slightly. "It's just beginning." In an instant, Carter bolted, darting past Angela and disappearing into the dense woods. "Suspect is fleeing," Angela shouted into her radio, giving chase. The other officers fanned out, their flashlights creating beams of light that flickered through the trees like ghostly apparitions. The woods were a maze of twisting paths and uneven ground. Carter moved with the desperation of a trapped animal, his breathing ragged as he clutched the camcorder against his chest. The knife, now slick with sweat, felt heavy in his other hand. Angela pushed forward, her flashlight catching glimpses of Carter ahead. "Carter, stop!" she yelled, her voice echoing through the trees. There's nowhere to run. Carter stumbled but quickly regained his footing. His mind raced. The chase wasn't part of his plan, but it was thrilling nonetheless. He glanced over his shoulder, his wild eyes catching the glint of Angela's flashlight. "They'll never stop me," he whispered to himself. "The story has to finish." The pursuit led to a clearing near an old, abandoned well. Carter stopped, his chest heaving as he turned to face Angela, who emerged from the trees moments later. She raised her gun, keeping a safe distance. "It's over, Carter," Angela said, her voice softer now. "You don't have to do this. Put the knife down." Carter's grip on the knife tightened. He looked down at the camcorder, then back at Angela. "You don't get it," he said, his voice breaking. "This isn't about me. It's about them. The world needs to see." Angela took a cautious step forward. "We'll make sure they see, Carter, but you're not the one who gets to decide how this ends." Carter hesitated, his resolve wavering. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might surrender. But then, with a sudden cry, he lunged toward the well, throwing the camcorder inside before Angela could stop him. "No!" Angela shouted, rushing forward as Carter collapsed to his knees, the knife slipping from his grasp. The sound of the camcorder hitting the bottom of the well echoed eerily in the quiet night. Carter looked up at Angela, his face streaked with tears but his expression eerily calm. "The story's down there," he said. "It's finished." Angela secured Carter in handcuffs, her heart pounding as the weight of the night's events settled over her. The camcorder might be gone, but she knew the case was far from over. The faint glow of dawn filtered through the trees as Detective Angela Reed sat on the edge of the abandoned well. The quiet hum of the forest was broken only by the distant voices of officers and the occasional chirping of birds. Carter Hayes had been taken into custody, his pale face betraying no emotion as he sat in the back of the patrol car. Angela stared down into the dark abyss of the well, her flashlight barely piercing its depths. The recovery team arrived an hour later, lowering a rope into the well to retrieve the camcorder. Angela watched as the device was brought to the surface, its casing scratched but intact. She felt a pang of relief. Whatever secrets Carter had tried to bury were now within reach. She handed the camcorder to a forensic technician. "Get this back to the station and extract everything," she ordered. "Every second of footage. I want to know exactly what's on here." At the precinct, Angela reviewed the files they'd managed to pull from the camcorder. The videos were disturbing, a harrowing insight into Carter's fractured mind. There were hours of footage documenting Margaret Lowell's final moments, including Carter's unsettling monologues as he manipulated her lifeless body. But there was more. Dozens of other recordings featuring Carter stalking various elderly residents in Willow Creek, narrating his thoughts like a filmmaker planning his next masterpiece. Carter sat in the interrogation room, his lanky frame slouched in the chair. Angela entered, her notepad in hand, and took a seat across from him. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with unspoken tension. "You've made quite a name for yourself," Angela began, her voice steady. "But this isn't the kind of fame you want, Carter." He tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Fame? No, it's not about that. It's about the story. Stories outlive us all." Angela leaned forward. "Margaret Lowell was a person, not a character in your twisted little narrative. Do you even understand what you've done?" Carter's smile faltered for a moment. He looked down at his hands as though searching for an answer. "She was already forgotten," he murmured. "I made her matter." The trial of Carter Hayes became a national spectacle. The media seized upon every grisly detail, dubbing him the auteur killer for his obsession with recording his crimes. The footage from the camcorder was played in court, shocking even the most seasoned reporters. Carter's expression remained unreadable as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Months later, Angela sat alone in her office, reviewing the final report on the case. Despite the closure, she couldn't shake the haunting feeling that Carter's story wasn't over. He had left behind too many unanswered questions, too many chilling insights into his mind. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was a colleague from the FBI. "Angela, you might want to hear this," the voice said. "A case just came across our desk. Different state, same MO, stalking elderly victims, recording the crimes, but this time, it's a copycat." Angela's heart sank. She looked out the window at the darkening sky, the weight of the revelation settling over her. The story Carter Hayes had started wasn't finished. It was spreading. As the call ended, Angela stared at the photo of Carter in his file. His eerie blue eyes seemed to stare back at her, as if he knew this was exactly what he had wanted all along. Some stories, she realized, don't end. They just keep being told.